Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Used Car Safety Ratings 2025. My name is Jerome Karslake and I'm the Director of the National Road Safety Partnership Program and its many activities. And I have the pleasure, so next slide please, Stuart. And I have the pleasure for moderating today's webinar. If you're unaware of the industry, please check out our website or reach for our newsletter. Even better, follow us on social media such as our LinkedIn page. Next slide, please. Today's session will go for approximately 60 minutes and will be a discussion of which will be delving into the 45 minutes for the slide and 15 minutes for questions as we go along through it. A PDF will be sent out following this and a link to the webinar. So I touched on that we want to make this as interactive as possible. Please throw your questions in down there in the Q&A box. The chat box is also open and we'll work through any questions as they come along. So thank you so much. And make this as interactive as possible as we go through it all. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'd like to recognise the funding members of the Vehicle Safety Research Group. We have those 9 government agencies. Without them, this would not be possible. So thank you very much for enabling us to deliver this and to do the work that is delivered through Monash University Accident Research Centre. Now, moving on to our presenter. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you, Jerome, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.
I'll give you a bit of a background of Stuart. He's done many things. So he's the director of the Monash University Accident Research Centre and also a leader in injury analysis and data teams. He holds a PhD in applied statistics and is accredited by the Australian Statistical Society. And as recently, he is also a fellow of the Australasian College of Road Safety. So big accomplishment there as well, Stuart. Welcome. So let's dive on in.
Thanks, Jerome. Before I start today, I'd really like to acknowledge the contribution some of my colleagues have made to the used car safety ratings process. Firstly, to Professor Max Cameron, who really pioneered this work in the early 90s and provided the really strong scientific basis on which we continue to deliver the work today. And my colleagues, Casey Rampollard and Professor Mike Keel, who both contribute significantly to making this ratings work happening. So I'm very pleased to acknowledge the contribution of the team involved in this work. So just an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about first our research database that underpins the used car safety ratings work. We'll give you a bit of a refresh of the used car safety ratings metrics that we use. We'll give you an overview of how the ratings are presented and what some of the ratings results are for this year. And then we'll go and talk about some of the broader trends in vehicle safety, because the Vehicle Safety Research Group, whilst the used car safety ratings are one of the primary outputs of the research, it is also an incredibly valuable tool for monitoring the progress in the safety performance of the vehicle fleet, the light vehicle fleet in Australia and New Zealand. So some really important insights will come towards the end of the presentation as well. And at the end of that, happy to take questions and discussion and thoughts that people might have that are listening today. So firstly, our research database is the tool that essentially underpins our ability to do all the work we do in the Vehicle Safety Research Group and to produce the used car safety ratings themselves. The database we assemble is essentially an aggregation of police reported crash data across the main states in Australia and in New Zealand as well. So we have crash data reported from Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia, as well as for the national database in New Zealand. We augment that by matching to information from the vehicle registers in those states as well. And we enhance that through retaining vehicle specification data, which is then being able to link through the information we get from the vehicle register that we get from sources including Red Book Australia, Right Car New Zealand, and the Commonwealth Government's road vehicle certification system, which is now housed under the Rover system. So it's quite a comprehensive collection of data, which essentially makes almost a national database for vehicle safety research in Australia and New Zealand, linking crashes to vehicle details in the register and enhancing that through third-party information to get down to the particular specifications and of vehicles so we can group them for a safety performance analysis. The database this year covers just over 9.5 million vehicles, light vehicles, involved in crashes across Australia and New Zealand, and records on 2.6 million road users who are injured in crashes involving those vehicles. And to support the metrics that we have, those road users include not only the occupants of the vehicles that we're rating, but also occupants of vehicles with which they collide and vulnerable road users with which they collide as well, so pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. So a very comprehensive and detailed database that underpins this work. When we are enhancing the database, identifying vehicle makes and models is a really important part of this, and being able to both identify the vehicles, identify the safety equipment fitted to those vehicles, and classifying them for the purpose of analysis, both into make and model groups as well as into market groups, so we can study broader aspects. And we do this by a process of decoding the vehicle identification numbers that are assigned to each vehicle. And we do that through the use of the information that we drag from Redbook and RVCS to identify. And we're able to then cluster vehicles into relatively homogeneous sets in terms of their likely safety performance. So we'll take make model lines and break them up into generational series. We'll then assign the market groups based on information that we glean from VFACTS, which classifies it based on the categories that VFACTS use for reporting vehicle sales in Australia. And you can see those 10 different market groups that we use that are more or less consistent with what VFACTS reports. They subcategorize some of these, but we tend to keep them in these 10 broader categories. So that makes sure that we're able to talk specifically about the vehicle's design, its specification, how that relates to safety outcomes. Through this data, we're able to calculate a number of safety metrics, which the used car safety ratings themselves are comprised of. If you think about essentially the road trauma train, we have registered vehicles that use the road. That is affected by road safety policies and settings. They're involved in critical events, which the vehicle itself can contribute to potentially avoiding a crash from through what we call active safety or crash avoidance features. And they include basic design features of the vehicle, but more recently, issues like our advanced driver assist systems like ESC, AEB, lane keep assist, and they help drivers avoid crashes in those critical situations. But if a crash does happen, we then look at the issue of what we call passive or secondary safety, which is about the ability of the vehicle to mitigate injury in the event of a crash. So it's about energy management to keep the forces within tolerance of people's biomechanical limits. And they define our two dimensions that we look at in vehicle safety. So we look at primary safety, crash avoidance, and we look at secondary safety, which is about injury mitigation in the event of a crash. So when we talk about secondary safety assessment, we have a few dimensions. The original crashworthiness ratings that Max Cameron worked on many years ago firstly considered this concept of crashworthiness, which is about how the vehicle prevents particularly its driver from death or serious injury in the event of a crash. And our metric reflects that probability. If you're involved in a crash, what is the probability that you'll be killed or seriously injured as a vehicle occupant and particularly as a driver. We tend to focus on mostly drivers in terms of our crashworthiness metrics because 95% of the time they are the most severely injured in the car, often because they're the only person in the car. But often in many of the police reported databases, we don't have good information on whether a passenger was present, only whether they were injured. And so that limits the assessment you can make. So crashworthiness is really about measuring the risk of death or serious injury to drivers in event of a crash. While most people think that is the primary thing they're looking for in a vehicle, it's also really important as a society that we have vehicles that don't pose undue risk to other road users. And this is where the concept of aggressivity comes about. And so that looks as a function of the vehicle that's colliding with you as another road user. What is your risk of being killed or seriously injured in a crash with that vehicle? So it's about collision partner protection, essentially, and that partner can be occupants of another vehicle or it can be unprotected road users, including motorcyclists, pedestrians, and cyclists. And so our metric is, again, the risk if you're involved in a crash where you're impacted by the vehicle or rating. What is your risk of being killed or seriously injured in that crash? We combine those two metrics together in a way that reflects their relevance to driving overall trauma in the community and what we call a total secondary safety measure, which weights them together. So crashworthiness, occupant protection is relevant in about 90% of crashes, so only excludes those where a pedestrian or cyclist is hit, which don't usually result to injury of the people in the vehicle. And aggressivity is relevant to about 55% of trauma outcomes in crashes where there's more than one road user involved, so excludes single vehicle crashes. And they're weighted together to give our total secondary safety index. And the total secondary safety is really a measure of the total social impact in terms of trauma of that vehicle on all people involved in crashes. So it's a very useful metric for looking at the impact of a vehicle on trauma outcomes in society generally. Our primary safety assessment really focuses on the fitment of ADAS features that we know from research evidence have proven to reduce crash risk. And these are based on a number of studies that VSRG have completed in the Australian and New Zealand context and include blind spot monitoring, autonomous emergency braking, lane departure warning, reversing cameras and sensors, electronic stability control, and most recently daytime running lights, which has been included in the primary safety assessment for the first time this year. And we put those together and say, based on their exposure to the crash types that can be mitigated by these technologies and the level that the technology mitigates those crashes, what is the total reduction in crash involvement risk that we expect from combinations of those technologies fitted? We look at differences by different vehicle classes based on how they're used, on how the relative relevance of each of those technologies applies as well. Our information comes out as a set of probabilities, our probability of being involved in a crash and our probability of being killed or seriously injured if that crash occurs. And we take that probability information and convert it into star ratings to make the information digestible for the general population. And we do that by, we combine the information together and then rank the vehicles in terms of best to worst performance and then divide them into what we call quintiles or equal 5 groups of performance and apply star ratings that way. There's been a number of ways this is done in the past, but it seems to be the way that's most consistent and gives the most consistent ratings year on year. And is consistent with other sort of performance indicators that the community is used to looking at. Star ratings are a very familiar thing, so it's easy for someone to go, okay, 5 star is good, 1 star is bad, and make rapid choices based on that level of information. Whilst we rate vehicles across them, for those vehicles that score in the best category for overall safety, we also subrate them to say our safer picks, and these are vehicles that not only perform well across the spectrum, they also have excellent driver protection and well above average performance for protecting other road users and avoiding crashes. So these are vehicles that score well across the spectrum and not just in one dimension, which gets them in that top rating category. So the safer pick is the one you really want to look for if you're looking at the brochure to make the best possible choice with regards to safety for you and other road users. Might leave the questions to the end at this stage. I think we're on a bit of a roll, so we might continue on if that's all right, Jerome.
Thanks, mate, Stuart. Happy for that, mate.
Excellent. All right, so what did we find in the used car safety ratings for 2025? Well, for this year, we added another year of crash data. So each year we incrementally update the crash data that's available. So this year we included 2023 year crashes from all the jurisdictions that contribute data to the system. That allowed us to rate another 23 vehicles that previously hadn't been rated and brings our total of vehicle rated to well over 550, which covers a fair proportion of the fleet. It also means the ratings for the vehicles that have previously been rated have more data available, so those ratings are commensurately more accurate year on year as well. Interesting, for the first time in the 2025 ratings, we actually have our first full electric vehicle that's been rated. So people have been interested to understand how electric vehicles perform in terms of safety because obviously they're heavier, some are faster. So understanding how they perform in the real world has been something that people have been asking for a while. So we have our first rated vehicle this time that we can talk about. So in practice, a vehicle has to have at least 500 real-world crash involvements to actually be rated in the vehicles. It rated in the ratings. In the brochure presentation that we have, which is available on many locations, we rate vehicles from 2001 onwards, although the ratings do cover vehicles manufactured from 1982 onwards. But given the average lifetime of a light vehicle in Australia is about 21, 22 years, most of the vehicles of interest will be manufactured after the year 2000 onwards. Prior to that, the vehicles are getting pretty ancient now and probably not typical use anymore. We do exclude those vehicles that are still on sale and have a current NCAP rating, but this year that actually only included one vehicle, so the separation in the ratings is quite important. And it's also important to note that used car safety ratings are a very different concept to NCAP. NCAP is about setting increasingly rigorous standards for new vehicle safety as they come into the fleet, and hopefully manufacturers respond and get all vehicles over the line to score 5 stars. Used car safety ratings about looking at everything that currently exists in the fleet and being able to make direct comparisons between any vehicle of any market group and any age in its performance in terms of safety from real world outcomes. And so they're quite complementary processes. People looking for a used car in the existing fleet should refer to used car safety ratings, and people looking for a new car should generally refer to NCAP and the requirements there. The good news is that the used car safety ratings do cover about 74% of the most popular vehicles on sale on Australian and New Zealand roads, so they're very relevant. But there is other ancillary information that can help you think about, well, if I'm just looking at an older car, what is the general performance of that car in various market groups too? And we'll get to that a bit later in the presentation. The good news is that for consumers, there's actually good, well-performing vehicles right across the sector. And so we'll go through a few of those in the different market groups. So whatever size or type of vehicle you're looking at, there's generally those that either score 5 stars, and many of those actually score a safer pick too. Pleasingly, and this has been a very difficult area because they're very light and compared to the rest of the fleet, we have a number of light vehicles that actually scored 5 stars on the overall assessment, and they're listed there. As I say, that's quite a challenge because often these vehicles are 600-700 kilos less in weight than the average vehicle in the fleet. And so in the event of a crash between two vehicles, a lot more of the crash energy is actually transferred to those light vehicles. So being able to perform well and well in relation to everything else on the road is a great achievement for those vehicles in the light vehicle class, which is fantastic. When we move up a class to small vehicles, we actually this seems to be almost the Goldilocks market group these days. We have quite a lot of vehicles that perform really well and get our safer pick, and vehicles that are really relatively affordable as well and plentiful in the second-hand market. And it seems that the specification of particularly our more modern light vehicles, are very good at protecting their occupants from injury in the event of a crash. but they're also, because they're not too big, not too heavy, they're actually really good at protecting other road users as well. So they get really good scores across the board. So as a safe pick, as an affordable vehicle, it's particularly good for city use. But beyond that, there's quite a range of popular vehicles to choose from, including really popular models like Toyota Corolla, Hyundai i30, and the Mazda 3. So many of these can be had for sort of well under $20,000 as a second-hand pick. Um, the medium-sized sector is one that's actually a little bit on the wane and is disappearing as a market sector, but they're also a really good class of vehicle in terms of optimizing safety, and a number of safer picks in there too of really quite affordable and available vehicles that can be chosen from. And there's when we talk about SUVs, good news is that SUVs, medium SUVs, which are almost the most popular market group in Australia and New Zealand now, there's a lot of really good performing vehicles in that class as well. People find them really useful for practical reasons. They're very popular, so there's lots of really good choices out there as safe used cars which achieve the safer pick tick. As you find you move up the tree a bit, so we're looking at larger SUVs and larger vehicles. Large vehicles are almost an extinct class, and you'll notice that many of the ones here are either old Australian-made cars or modern luxury cars. There's a number of better picks there. These vehicles tend to become more aggressive to other road users, so they don't often score the same safer pick option, and some of the older ones don't have the ADAS technology in them either, so they've dropped off the safer pick. But there are a number of safer pick larger SUVs available, sort of replacing these, which is probably good news for people who want a bit more space and capacity. When we talk about people movers, there's some good options there too. Again, they tend to be a little bit aggressive, so not the best choice for other road user safety, but certainly for occupant protection and hence overall safety, they score pretty well. Commercial vehicles, as in commercial vans, really difficult to score safely then. A lot of them have really poor specifications for occupant protection measures, and so there's actually only one that scored 5-star, which was the Ford Transit, a modern European design. So that is the pick from the used car safety ratings in terms of a commercial van. Here is the problem market group, though. We're looking for a safer commercial ute. Not a single one of them scored 5 stars. And in fact, 61% of the market group only scored 1 star in overall safety. And it's really a big piece of news because this is quite a popular market group in Australia and New Zealand, yet the safety performance of these vehicles is generally quite poor. If we look at occupant protection performance, a number of the newer ones do okay, but not really better than much smaller cars. One of the key statistics that surprises people that based on the used car safety ratings, the occupant protection performance of a Toyota Hilux is the same as a Toyota Corolla, despite it weighing about 800 kilos more, which is really surprising. But where they really fall down as a market group is the aggressivity. So the danger they pose to other road users is extreme, and we'll get back to that in a little while. But and that's why none of them score 5 stars, and just all of them uniformly score 1 star for aggressivity. So a real problem market group. So some general trends. Generally, newer vehicles are safer than old vehicles, because they've got better occupant protection equipment such as airbags, etc. But also many of them have, the newer vehicles are the ones most likely to have the ADAS protection as well. If we actually look at occupant protection performance in a 2023 vehicle compared to a 2021 vehicle, in the same crash, same circumstances, you're about 43% less likely to be killed or seriously injured in a crash in the 2023 vehicle versus 2001 vehicle. And when we look at the total impact of road trauma, The 2023 vehicle reduces total road trauma by about 31% compared to the 2001 vehicle in the same crash circumstances. So newer is better, but not always. And that's why looking at the guide, there is variation at every year of manufacture between the vehicles on offer. And so using the guide is really important to identify the ones that do perform well. And particularly so we can put the most vulnerable road users like our elderly and our young drivers in the safest vehicles. So really important to look at the guide and choose the vehicles that are safest. I want to stop there for any quick questions or anything in the chat, Jerome, that
We do, Stuart. I think this is a really good one. You mentioned how we had our first EV flow into the ratings. So our first question is around that. So David asks, has the data indicated any difference in crash outcomes between an EV and an ICE vehicle of the same make and model?
um, No, in fact, the first electric vehicle that's come into the ratings is the Tesla Model 3 because it's the first electric vehicle that's actually sold in significant numbers across Australia and New Zealand. And that actually scored 5 stars across the board. And it's interesting because the Tesla Model 3 is essentially a medium vehicle. So it's about the same size as a Toyota Camry, same sort of dimensions and aspects. And we know that medium vehicles as a class actually perform very well. Now, the fact that the Tesla Model 3 is probably around 250 kilos heavier than a Toyota Camry, for example, it doesn't actually score badly in aggressivity. So the additional weight is not penalizing it in terms of its aggressivity performance. And its occupant protection performance is excellent. So for that car, it actually looks very much like your best performing medium vehicle ICE. So I would say the electrification has made zero difference there, despite the fact it's a little bit heavier. What we will be interested in is seeing some of the other models come in because most of the, or a lot of the electric vehicles that have come in, for example, the Model Y is an SUV. That's probably the next most popular vehicle that's been sold in Australia and New Zealand. That's a much bigger, heavier vehicle with different dimensions. So it'll be interesting to see how those more SUV body styles perform in terms of aggressivity, where they've got both additional weight plus potentially poor geometry that goes with it. So I think this is a sort of teaser on a whole lot more interesting information that will come in the future when we start getting a bigger range of electrified vehicles in the ratings. But early indications are not too bad, despite the additional weight. They don't seem to be particularly more aggressive, which is good to see.
Do you think, Stuart, as part of that, some of the new ADAS technologies, could they be more effective than some of the EV vehicles coming along that might help offset that weight mass?
Possibly, and this will become more important because this is an issue with, for example, our commercial utes. Is it because they're so aggressive? Crash avoidance actually becomes a really important aspect of that vehicle because you don't actually want them to crash into people. So ADAS becomes a critical adjunct to that. But as I'll get to later in the presentation, ADAS has advantages currently, but not probably to the degree that is required to offset some of these other problems that we're seeing. So we'll get back to that later in the presentation.
It's a perfect segue to move on. Looking forward to it.
Thanks very much. So as I said, another really important aspect of the Vehicle Safety Research Group work through the used car safety ratings is able to look at trends in vehicle safety and understand what is happening out there and what the changes in market preferences for different vehicle types are potentially doing to the safety performance of the fleet. One of the first things we did, and we've done this for a number of years, is to look at the improvement in crashworthiness by different vehicle years of manufacture. And here you can actually see the average crashworthiness of vehicles manufactured all the way from 1963 through to 2023. And this is where we got the figure before. So if you look at the 2001 vehicle compared to the 2003 vehicle, that's the 43% reduction in average risk of death or serious injury to the driver you see between those points. If we go right back to vehicles from the 1960s, we can see that the occupant protection performance is improved essentially 4.5-fold. So you're about 4.5 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured in a car from the 1960s versus one manufactured more recently. And you can see that's partly a result from some getting in some basic Australian design rules concerned with safety. There's been also some correlated trends with the introduction of consumer programs like NCAP, so they've been important for driving it. And we have some more recent ADRs. And uh, in more recent times, also improved design parameters, additional airbags. So now we've got, for example, center airbags coming into vehicles, and they're helping further improve that. Looks like we had a little bit of a plateau sort of between 2015 to 2020, and that's possibly because that was when the radical changes to more preference for commercial vehicles, which we know their performance isn't as good, stagnated that improvement. But there's evidence that we're now seeing perhaps the next step of improvement as this sort of next wave of technology comes along as well. So that's encouraging. If you look at the different market groups, you can actually see overall how the different market groups perform in crashworthiness. So there's definitely a correlation between size and crashworthiness. And remember, we compare all vehicles to all other vehicles in this. So the issue of mass and size are an issue. So the larger a vehicle is and the heavier it is, the better it tends to perform. And you can see that in the SUV space. You can see that in the regular passenger car space. But it does highlight particularly the occupant protection performance issues we have with the very lightest cars in the fleet. But also does highlight again that for our commercial vehicles, they're often heavier than average, but they don't really perform better than a typical passenger car despite that mass, and that's due to the design deficits we see. It's interesting to see that those general patterns in relativity of performance have changed over the different time periods as well. So this is essentially that chart repeated for different blocks, 5-year blocks of vehicle years of manufacture. And it's interesting to see in our most recent vehicles, the market groups that perform best, our medium and large cars, are actually the market groups which are least prevalent on the road. So our small and medium SUVs are the most popular market groups, along with commercial utes, and they're actually not the best performers. So this is what I was talking about before. By choosing these vehicles in preference to our regular passenger vehicles, we actually sub-optimize their occupant protection performance of the fleet. We'll get back to that in a minute. When we look at trends in aggressivity, this is really where we haven't made great gains. In fact, you can see here that the only gain we've had was in sort of the late 2000s. And that is actually corresponds to the time where we got some default benefits from the introductions in Europe and Japan of some pedestrian protection standards, which are mandated there, but not here. But they seem to have driven down our aggressivity slightly. But certainly that's an area where we haven't made great progress, and probably our preference for going for particular SUVs and utes as our primary market choices is certainly not helping to improve that. Hasn't been disastrous in terms of driving it backwards en masse, but it hasn't helped improve it any further either. Oops, sorry, they're taking a building apart, so I hope it's not coming through the background. A lot of banging, crashing. And this is where you look at market groups and you see some of the stark problems with partner collision protection here. And this is where we see particularly the commercial and the large SUVs are particularly problematic for aggressivity. But in fact, if you can compare every regular passenger car class with the SUV class, SUVs are incrementally more aggressive because of their higher ride height, primarily, and probably being slightly heavier as well. So that's an interesting construct to think about. And again, if you look at the trends over time, this is where it's quite significant to look at particularly our commercial ute sector. Whereas if we go back 40 years' time, our large SUVs were the problem. They've actually improved quite significantly. But if you notice the aggressivity of our commercial utes has actually, if anything, got slightly worse in the last 2 decades because they got bigger and heavier. And now utes are the most aggressive vehicle type on the road, followed by large SUVs and interestingly, people movers as well. I guess the good news is that the modern tranche of medium SUVs, which are so popular, aren't terribly bad, but they're still worse than if we were, for example, to be driving a medium car, which is the dark blue line there. So there's a compromise in total road trauma outcomes related to worsening aggressivity of the types of vehicles that we're choosing to drive. So we look at total seconds. So this is the overall trauma impacts of changes in the vehicle fleet. We see that improved because they're heavily influenced by crashworthiness, which has improved. But they haven't improved so much, particularly in this recent time, because our aggressivity improvements haven't been realised and our crashworthiness improvements have been hampered a little bit by our changing preference in vehicles too. So that's an interesting artefact there. But still, there's been significant gains over time. And again, we can see the different performance of the market groups. Interesting, as a group as a whole, the medium SUVs are actually one of the better classes. So that's encouraging because they're quite popular. But if we look at this in the most recent times, so this is effectively what's coming. This again highlights the problem with the commercial utes and the trauma impact that they're having overall. And people are wondering why our road toll is going backwards, and our penchant for driving these types of vehicles is partly to blame. Of course, the other one when we talk about total safety is our light vehicle class. But this one's growing, and the light vehicle class is actually shrinking in popularity out there in the market. So we can, from that, project what we expect in the future in terms of the vehicle fleet contributing to our road safety objectives in the country. And finally here, I think we're just about on time. We've had a look at our general trends in crash risk reduction due to ADAS fitment. Now, this reflects both the proportion of vehicles fitted with ADAS technology, as well as the effectiveness of that ADAS technology as measured from real-world evaluations. And so I've overlaid that of different vehicle years of manufacture, and see what contribution in terms of crash reduction are different vehicle years having through their ADAS fitment. And as you can see, well, from the sort of mid-2000s, particularly where the fitment of electronic stability control became quite common. It's actually started to be common from it became available from the mid-90s, but it became very commonly fitted from about the mid-2000s onwards. We see a steep ramp up in ADAS technology. But for the average vehicle sold in 2023, you can expect about a 14.5% reduction in crash risk due to the range of ADAS technologies actually fitted to that vehicle. So that's a significant gain in terms of crash risk reduction that ADAS is bringing to us. But it's important to note here, we've got a 14% reduction. If we think about the differential between the best and the worst vehicle for occupant protection in the event of a crash, that difference is about 15 times. So 15 times more likely to be killed in the worst vehicle than the best one as an occupant. And even if we look at aggressivity, the difference of the best and the worst vehicles is about a 5.5 factor as well. So as you can see, if you compare it here, ADAS is making a difference, but it's actually still secondary safety out there in the vehicle fleet that is having the biggest impact on road trauma in this country and in New Zealand. So that's important to note. Now, obviously, we want this to keep growing, and we want to keep refining the ADAS technologies so they're more and more effective and cover more and more crash types. But that gives an indication of their sort of relative importance in the fleet now. So about 15% reduction versus a 15-fold increase for occupant protection. So I think that just helps add some perspective as to where the heavy lifting is still being done in terms of vehicle safety. Whether we can continue to improve secondary safety the way we're seeing in the last decades, well, I think there's still some potential there. And in fact, some work MEARC has done suggests that there's still potentially a 30% reduction if we all had vehicles with the best secondary safety performance. We could reduce road trauma by a further 30%. Obviously, if every vehicle had all the ADAS technologies, we could probably get another 10 to 12% out of that with the current technologies and potentially a further gain with whatever is coming in the future as well. But it shows you that both of these dimensions continue to be important, and it's really important to think about the mix of vehicles that we want in our fleet to optimize safety for the community as well. All of these things are important, and this work helps quantify the heavy lifting that each component of our safety performance in the light vehicle fleet is undertaking. So I think that's our overview today. I think we're just about on time, Jerome. We're even a few minutes early, so happy to take some additional questions if people have questions about those trends and other observations they have.
I do indeed have a few questions to throw at you, Stuart. And I thought, and there's a great one from Leslie here. Do you get any indication of if any aspect of ADAS was switched off during reported incidences?
No, we know from research that's been conducted recently that a lot of people are switching the technology off, and that's becoming a significant issue that people look at. The estimates that I used to produce that last chart are basically the average real-world effectiveness. So that will be reflective of both the effectiveness of the technology and the proportion of people that are actually using it, because even the evaluation studies, we don't know how many people have actually switched the technology off. And that could be quite substantial. For example, if we talk about lane keep assist, the European evaluations estimated about a 45% run-off road crash reduction with the fitment of lane keep assist. Our Australian estimate, that was about half that at about 22%. And we suspect it's a combination of, firstly, people switching it off because the system annoys them or gives them false positives. And secondly, because a lot of our road network doesn't have the supporting infrastructure like line marking to actually make it work properly. And so these are two things that need to be concentrated on, and that could probably increase that ADAS effectiveness that we talked about from the 14% we have in the sort of more recent vehicles to higher. So, for example, if we could get lane keep assist up to 40% reduction in those that crash type, that figure might look like more like 18%, for example. So we need to focus both on the standard infrastructure to support our ADAS, so make sure we have the key things in place like good road surface to support AEB, good line marking to support lane keep assist, and good speed signage to support ISA systems that are coming into vehicles now as well. One of our PhD students at MUARC did a study looking at these things and found significant deficits in performance from lack of infrastructure to support. But we also need to be concentrating on issues like usability experience of ADAS features for the people using the vehicles to make sure that these systems are not giving them a million false positives or erroneous readings that are annoying them and encouraging them to switch the systems off. Because we know there's a huge difference in the range of systems currently out there on the road. And I think NCAP are thinking about focusing on this, and certainly other studies are looking at this as an issue, but we need to get that right. And perhaps having future standards for performance of those in terms of maximum rates of false positives and false negatives might be a benefit to improving the ADAS effectiveness that we have. But yeah, that's a very good question, a very good point. And I think we're in this country and in probably New Zealand too, are forgoing some of the benefits we could be getting out of that technology.
You touch on the element possibly in the future of ANCAP, including ADASs and some of those performance. What about the other side about could there be avenues for ANCAP to include? So the question there around, is there indication of was it switched off? Could they also include part of the reporting? So when there is a crash, it's mandatory as part of your ANCAP performance that you're able to provide the ADAS data, what was going on as part of the vehicle.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where we do have data deficits, and it'd be interesting to know, for example, in the EDR data that could be collected, whether the vehicle will report whether the systems are on or off or not and how reliably, because that'd be then a very good indication of what that looks like in terms of crash involvement. But I also think consumers, when you actually survey them, are quite happy to report this stuff. So keeping a cross-sectional monitor of community behaviour in response to these things through regular surveys could also be quite useful. And it could be could be good feedback for different manufacturers too, particularly the ones that are reported to have a lot higher problems um, with false positives that annoy people. And if you scan the sort of motoring media, Hyundai Kia is one where people are infuriated by their ISO systems, and they actually changed it so there's a mute button for the audible warning. They still got a visual warning from it as well. And a lot of the new Chinese brands that are coming in are getting pretty poor reports on performance for ADAS false positives as well. So being able to report back on those and work with the manufacturers to improve that, I think, would improve the overall benefits we get from ADAS systems in the future.
It's one of the other parts, I guess, drawing that further, if a driver becomes a habit, it's like a habit is putting your seatbelt off on. If your habit becomes flicking it all off every time you get into a vehicle because of issues, that'll probably flow into other vehicles as well when they move around. Do you think that's a possible risk?
Absolutely. If people get used to not wanting to have them on because they think they're counterproductive, that will potentially flow to other vehicles where it might be better calibrated. And so instilling positive behavior across all vehicle experiences is important. That's why you need to be particularly giving feedback to the manufacturers whose systems aren't performing that well, and hopefully getting them to improve them would be a great target.
So, question here: what's the difference between the best and worst vehicles in terms of crash avoidance? Big question.
Yeah, well, that's what we see. So the worst vehicles are obviously our older ones. So they're basically, in terms of the ADAS performance, they don't have any ADAS, so there's no assistance there. It's entirely up to the driver. The best ones that have all the current features, I think the best vehicle we see has just under 20% crash reduction if that has absolutely everything. And I think that's, again, it's useful to monitor that and keep evaluating those technologies because we're seeing better performance in high-speed AEB. We're seeing higher rates of fitment of vulnerable road user AEB. We've got junction assist that's coming in now as well. We've got lane trace uh, coming in, which can help potentially with fatigue or could make it worse. Who knows if people fall asleep on it. But the other one that's I think is of great interest that's receiving a bit of attention is the driver monitoring systems, not only because it's potential to detect fatigue, they also might be able to detect other sort of impaired driving and warn the drivers too. I think the big question with driver monitoring systems particularly is how people respond to those particularly because do they warn early enough and do people sort of take credence from when they go, oh, actually, I might not be in a state to drive, I better pull over. Is that how people respond? So we know that simple warning systems can often be ignored. So what intervention might be required or what response are we expecting from people using driver state monitoring systems? If they think I'm fine, but they're actually not fine and turn it off because it's annoying them, that could be quite catastrophic as well. So there's still a lot to play out in that space as we move towards greater autonomy.
Right. There's a question here from Remus, and I think I know the answer. I haven't seen any Chinese manufactured vehicles in this presentation. As we are seeing more and more on Australian roads, are they going to be considered in a further presentation? So,
Absolutely, very good question, and it's fair to say, and that because of the requirement to get adequate real world experience, it really takes about 5 years before we see vehicles enter the used car safety ratings. And it's become a little bit more problematic because the Australian fleet, because we've got so many new brands and so many different types of vehicles coming into the country, that market is getting a bit more diffuse. So um, that makes the time to actually be able to rate a vehicle um, a bit longer, and that's why we do this sort of general trend stuff because that at least gives us some indication of where the current fleet is going. You can do the more recent stuff more readily, but it'll be very interesting to look at some of the Chinese vehicles and their performance. Some of the NCAP testing has suggested there's a bit of variability in that performance. How it plays out in the real world, it sort of reminds me of going back to the late 90s where we had the first influx of Korean vehicles, and many of those actually perform quite poorly in their safety performance. Whether we'll see the same thing in the Chinese vehicles or whether their development is rapid enough, the Chinese seem to learn things very quickly and adapt fairly quickly. So what they'll look like, what the early introduction models will look like, remains to be seen. But manufacturers like MG and BYD are getting a significant market presence. So I imagine that we'll start to see some of their vehicles enter the ratings in the next couple of years. Um, and that'll be interesting to track what that looks like. But it's a good question. But unfortunately, because we're doing it retrospectively, we have to wait for the population to crash enough of their vehicles to make an assessment, and that takes time. And again, it's why it's important to have a sort of prospective assessment in NCAP and then a retrospective assessment to make sure we're heading in the right direction. They complement each other very well as programs.
Right. Leslie asks, does the data include such information as the vehicle having any modification present? For example, an already potentially poor performing ute also having bull bars fitted, which could have increased risk or injury levels.
Yep, another excellent question. We would love to know where a vehicle has been modified, and certainly our friends in the New South Wales government always ask us about this question. But no, there is no requirement to report modification of a vehicle in that way. So none of the vehicle registers have that as an indication. It might be good if we could mandate an engineering inspection for a bull bar fitment and hence then recording in the state uh, vehicle systems when a vehicle has been modified in that way, and then we'd have the data to do it. But unfortunately, at the moment, there's no records of those modifications anywhere and no reporting in the police data of where vehicle modifications such as bull bars or lift kits or whatever else have been fitted. And so that's something we'd love to do, but it's a real limitation of the data at the moment. I think there's potential, but how far are we likely to get with it? I don't know. But it's probably at least a partial reason for some of the high aggressivity of the commercial use because they're the market group probably more often fitted with bull bars and other issues. And further, the trade sector too, they're often fitted out to their maximum GVM with toolboxes and other things on the back. So they're not only modified that way, they're also modified, which increases their weight as well.
I was just wondering, there's another question you had here really just touched on that as well. So I think you've covered off the answer for that. What is the average age of our fleet at the moment, Stuart?
I think the average age of the light vehicle fleet in Australia is nudging up to about 11 and a half, 12 years. The average lifetime is actually another important figure, and the average lifetime that a light vehicle is on the road in Australia is about 22 years. So that's why these decisions are so important, because whatever we do now in terms of putting things into our fleet, we've got to live with for at least the next 22 years. And that's one of the longest surviving fleets. The New Zealand average age is a bit higher. I think it's somewhere around 14 and a half years, I think, because of the used import program. But I don't think their average lifetime is much different because they tend to get rid of their vehicles earlier as well. But those two, I think the lifetime figure is quite important because you've still got that vehicle in there circulating in the fleet for those 22 years that someone's actually using it.
So I guess the crucial decision is at the very point of when a vehicle's first purchased. It's going to be around with us for 22 years. So whatever we buy, it's going to impact our safety for a long time.
That's right. And so this is why it's the impacts of vehicle fleet effects, they take a long time to kick in and a long time to wash out. So whatever you do, whatever change you make, you don't see immediate benefit. It takes years to get total benefit. So even if we think of the impact of electronic stability control, which was mandated in for all vehicles in 2012, we're only just now seeing pretty much 100% of the vehicle fleet almost fitted with electronic stability control that's actually out there driving around now. So that's the sort of delay you have in this process. And even now we have some mandate for AEB. It's not going to be for another 15 years that we see just about every vehicle on the road, light vehicle, having some form of AEB fitted to it. And this is the point, though, because one of the things we focus on very closely with the Vehicle Safety Research Group is the impact on novice drivers, because they're often driving the vehicles that are 12, 15 years old plus, and they're the ones that have none of the technology. So they don't get that benefit until 15 years down the track as a road user group. So how we can turn that around is one of the key questions, and some of the benefits you could derive from turning that around come out of looking at this work. I talked before about potentially being able to reduce trauma by 30% if we all went for the safest vehicle choice. That figure is more like 60% for the novice driver sector. So there's a huge potential to reduce trauma in that sector by improving vehicle choice. And that's why for that sector particularly, the used car safety rating is absolutely critical. If you're going to put your novice driver in a car, you want them to be able that car to help them avoid crashes as well as mitigate injury if they have a crash, because they know that it's such high risk. And so it's a critical resource for them. And a lot of what the work that the used car safety rating is focused on over the years is particularly focused on novice drivers and getting into better cars. And that's why I had things like the Unsafe to Safe program trial in Victoria, which is aimed to try and change by behaviour. But it's also working with parents, because so often they're the ones making the decision and assisting the young driver to get into their first car, and making a smart choice is really critical.
So what's some of the price points we're looking at to get it the safest vehicle, the safest choice?
Well, for example, you can get yourself into a second-hand Hyundai i30 or Mazda 3 for $12,000-13,000. So in modern parlance, where a new vehicle is sort of costing you $35,000 and up, it's really reasonably affordable to get into those sort of cars. So it's not that they're not out there, and they're not out there in reasonable numbers to buy. So that's again why it's important, because you can actually find these vehicles. And I think a number of the websites that are around talk about availability as well. But certainly we have a partnership with Car Sales / Redbook, and the information on safety is available when you go and look up the vehicles and look up things in Redbook, which is useful.
Just a question here that's come through around comparisons between ANCAP versus used car safety ratings. Any thoughts on that?
They've got very different objectives, so you really shouldn't compare them. There's plenty of good research that shows that NCAP is very much demonstrated to drive the safety of the fleet forward. NCAPs, as I say, is about setting a bar that you hope everyone clears to get 5 stars, and continually raising that bar to improve the standard of new vehicles coming into the fleet. A really important program, because that's the point of entry, and that's the point we want to make. Used car safety ratings is about helping understand where the fleet's going, and essentially the used car safety rating is a little bit of a byproduct of that fleet monitoring and evaluation process to say, well, this is what we measure. But it's important, and I think the contribution of the VSRG and used car safety ratings in tracking fleet performance and showing those improvements we've had over time essentially helps validate the approach that NCAP takes in raising that bar and getting safer new vehicles into the fleet in the first place. So complementary and both necessary.
Just emphasizing that point, as you were saying, 22 years is how long the vehicles remain on average in the market. So you want them all 5-star ANCAP as a starting point.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, so I think we're just coming up on time now. I'd just like to close out and just ask you, what would be your take-home message you'd like to leave with everyone from today's webinar?
Well, as I often talk to the public, and the public talk about their priorities they think about a vehicle, and they worry about the price, they worry about the utility, the style. Safety should come number one when you're making a choice. There's lots of good information. Use that information to make safer choices, and it could have a major impact on your future. So the information's there, please use it.
Your future or loved one or someone else as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through this year's used car safety ratings for 2025. And thank you everyone for asking the great questions that came through and making this interactive possible. As I said, there'll be a link sent out to everyone for today's webinar, and a PowerPoint Stuart walked through as well. So if you have any further questions, please shoot them through to Stuart. There's his email address there if you have any. But thank you very much. And please promote and share the used car safety rating. So thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.